You know, the session title, How Economic Actors Cooperate and Organise, there's a huge amount that could be discussed within that. I will touch on bits of both papers, but also talk a little bit about my own work as a macroeconomist. So yeah, I mean, I think if I took two broad messages from across the two papers, and this is me, you know, putting myself up in a hot air balloon to a level where air becomes difficult to get a big picture view of the two, to link them. I think the two would be that understanding the behaviours of people is important, and the other is that uncertainty matters, and in particular different types of uncertainty might matter. And, you know, I think the bottom line is I agree. So maybe that's the end of the discussion. I walk away, macro is fine. You know, I think Charles was trying to be a bit provocative to the macro people in the room. You know, we are in the real world, and I'm, you know, I'm quoting back at him now the motto of his employer, who educated me, by the way. So to understand the cause of things. I mean, that really is what macroeconomists, anthropologists, psychologists, you know, what most of us in social sciences are trying to do. We're trying to understand the cause of things. Now we're trying to understand the cause of different things. And I think that's a really important point to make, and I'll make that as I go along. The first big idea I want to sort of drive home in what I'm discussing is that the idea of standing up here and me saying, I'm a macroeconomist because I use this model, or I'm not a macroeconomist because I don't use this model, I find ludicrous. I think my field of study, or your field of study, is determined by this phenomena you're studying, the questions you're trying to answer, rather than the methods that you're using. And I think that ultimately the benchmark for quality is always the same. What has the study that's been undertaken taught me that I didn't know before? Okay? I like the approaches economists take. We can call that a behavioral bias, if you will, or there's something endogenous in me that came like manna from heaven at birth that made me an economic type person, but that's certainly the approaches I like. But that's not to say that I think we should therefore not engage with other fields, or we should dismiss what other fields have to say, but rather I think if we're all looking at the same question, I think there's very complementary overlaps. Two aspects that I actually really like about being an economist are, I do like some of the theories that we use, not because I think they are perfect descriptions of the real world, but because they provide a discipline to how we think about channels. Okay? And in particular, related to this session, I think economists have done a lot of thinking about the role of information and strategic behavior in the interaction of people. And I also think, you know, one thing that I always think of as fundamental, particularly to macro, is the sort of endogeneity of the state of the world to the choices being made. So I'm going to go even further, as you were talking, Charles, I wrote down the Barrow point. But what's really interesting about the Barrow point is not just to think about what is the role of religion on macro outcomes, but what's the role of macro outcomes on choices about religion. And I think this sort of endogeneity is very useful. Now, of course, what's the cost of trying to think about it and a sort of the endogeneity within the system? It is that you have to get in your hot air balloon and go all the way up and think about things from a rather high, and you might call it unrealistic level, but it's a level at which I can think about these things with still some control on the issues. The other aspect I like about being an economist is I do think, as a social science, largely because, you know, Rosemary has fought this fight herself for many years, but it's only very recently in our discipline that we've started taking, you know, experiments and RCTs even particularly seriously. And so as a result, a lot of our statistical analysis was based on observational data, and as a result we put a lot of effort into thinking about. And maybe you'll argue that we've gone too far, the classic economist identification police, always worried about endogeneity, oh but why did they do that, what's the driving force, why did the policy change? I actually think it's a very healthy skepticism to approach all statistics with. There's that beautiful cartoon I should have included here, where they have the people talking and one of them says, oh, I took a class on statistics, I learned that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. And the person goes, oh, it seems like you really learned something. And the response is, meh. Life is a lot easier before you learn about causal inference. Okay, so what does it... There's a big overriding question about, therefore, how detailed we should model things. Okay? And like I say, I do like macro models. That does not mean every macro model I like, but I learn things from macro models. I learn economic channels. It does not mean I think that those are exact replications of the world, but rather I've learned something by the exercise that's undertaken. It also doesn't mean that if something is not in the model, that that's not important. But in some sense, the big challenge, if you're going down the modeling route, would be to really understand how these, for example, different types of uncertainty, for me as a macroeconomist, how at a macro level we should think about the different types. Because I think macro thinks in different ways about firm formation. I'm not an expert on this. I thought when I got your slides on Sunday, I was looking at them and I was thinking I should have got my colleague who does a lot of work on thinking about how firms start up, and some turn into these gazelle firms that create a lot of jobs, and some just stay at 2 or 3 person enterprises. These are important questions for the macroeconomy, and the question for me would, how would these extra dimensions of uncertainty be captured within that? You know, equally, you know, I think religion is an important topic to study. I think, you know, substance abuse is an important issue facing society. But if Silvana asked me to tell her what we know about the monetary transmission mechanism, as important as those things are, I have yet to be convinced that substance abuse has altered the monetary transmission mechanism. I can think of channels how it might, but it has yet to be driven home to me. Okay? So I think that for me, the question on what we include in our models has to be what are the interesting interactions that will occur within the model. And again, from a macro perspective, and I'm thinking about understanding the bigger interactions in the whole economy, rather than particularly, you know, again, other people do this, but the interactions between, you know, individual agents within it, I think, you know, we have to make some decisions. But I want to start, I want to sort of say I am sort of on your side, because I actually do spend quite a bit of my work, and Peter kindly mentioned some of it earlier, but I do spend quite a bit of my work looking at the study of the interaction of people, or at least, you know, policymakers, who I think are people. You know, and that's, again, I copied this from something else, I forgot to change the heading. The starting point of a lot of my work was, central banks don't set monetary policy, people do. And to think carefully about how, when thinking about your design of the institutions, how the interaction of those people will be affected by the environment in which you put them. I think this is an important topic. So we have here the classic kind of classifying people as doves or dovish or hawkish or hawks or centrist. They're sometimes called pigeons for a reason I have no idea, apart from it's a different bird. But I think it matters. And I think understanding how people react in that environment matters. So I have some work that looks at signaling by policymakers, trying to create your own reputation and what you might behave like. And this was a quote from Stephanie Flanders around the time that Mario Draghi was appointed. Say, yeah, if you're sitting in Spain or Portugal, you might wonder whether you're better off with a German in charge, trying to show off his inner Italian, than an Italian desperate to prove he's German. Again, that was a point about he is reacting to the environment and the institutions and the expectations that will be formed about him. These are important questions. This hawk-dove thing, I actually, you know, it's used a lot in monetary economics, the field I spend most of my time. I actually don't like it as a definition. There's actually another, this is very geeky, there's a DC comic called The Hawk and the Dove. And I prefer to think of monetary policy makers like this, like superheroes. Actually, it's been very good. Like monetary policymakers, the characters in the hawk and the dove also evolve. And so they went to a point with now a male and a female. And unlike monetary policy committees, the current incarnation of the hawk and the dove are two females running the policy committee. What do I mean by superheroes? I mean, again, this is a very reduced form way of thinking about lots of important, difficult, psychological, network effects, everything. But again, it takes into account uncertainty. But in some of my work, rather than think that Silvana, when she sits on the committee, has a preference for low rates or high rates, I think Silvana, like everybody else, has a preference for the right rate. But she's in a world of uncertainty. And in a world of uncertainty, she might have a bias to avoid one mistake more than another. And that's how we treated it. We modeled it. We went into a lot of detail on this. Even though it's very reduced form, understanding this gets quite complicated. So knowing that that's how I think about it, do I get very upset when in macro models they put the monetary reaction function in as a very simple, like one, there's no committee, there's just one person, there's an interest rate at month M chosen as a function of the state of the world, plus some shocks. No, because that's a level of abstraction that I don't mind if we're trying to think about the effect of interest rate changes on investment. But if I'm trying to tell the world how to design a monetary policy committee, I have to put a bit more effort. Now, all of you are welcome to say my efforts were rubbish and write your own efforts. And that would be great. That's progress. But the point is, what you put in does depend on what you're trying to analyze. And with Andy, we did some experiments on communication. We did randomized experiments giving different types of samples, different information, to see whether the central bank talking in its usual way, the monetary policy summary, or with some new, more accessible, easy communication, changed the way people thought. And we asked them questions before, we asked them questions after, and we saw what happened. Turns out it matters. Everybody found the easy content easier to read. That's just a test to make sure that the bank had done the right thing in their, what they call layered easy content. But what was very interesting was, although directionally both groups improved their perception of the bank as a trustworthy institution, MPhil students, who I classify as my economists got very excited, and statistically significantly so. They felt, yeah, this is a big step forward, the bank is doing great things. The public, who on average started with about the same level of confidence in the institution, although they went in the right direction, not statistically so. But what also happened was, showing them the layered content made the public much more likely adjust back to what the central bank's view was, so to manage their expectations, the big achievement of communication. Trained economists did not, although it went in the right way. Uncertainty, this is the other aspect. So again, uncertainty I think of mostly in monetary policy terms. Uncertainty is not just an important feature of monetary landscape, it's the defining characteristic of that landscape. Again, this is an area that macro is thinking about more and more and more. But one reason why I think it's really interesting for people like Silvana is both reacting to uncertainty and potentially creating uncertainty. Silvana is not. Silvana is a very steady... not her on her own. As a cut. Okay, I'll stop. But just to say. Okay. But again, this sort of came up earlier. Greenspan's been invoked on a few occasions for his wonderful communication of non-clarity of communication. But here's the media reaction to one of his conference speeches in 2000. Greenspan sees chance of recession. Recession is unlikely, Greenspan concludes. Recession risk up, Greenspan concludes. Fed chairman doesn't see recession on the head. There's 4. Now, these are not inconsistent. Think about it. The recession risk was low. It went up a bit. It's still low, but it's not zero. These are consistent. But what's interesting is, when he communicates this, each of these papers therefore sends a different message out to the readers of the New York Times, Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, Wall Street Journal. There's a lot of stuff that we still have to think about and do. So we did something So Stephen Hansen and I, this is some newer work that we're working on at the moment. We took speeches by central bank officials in the run-up to their decision. And we used machine learning techniques, so we were being very data intensive in the real world, but we used these machine learning techniques to classify what signals were being sent about interest rates. Now, we then classified whether or not the period running up to the decision was everybody speaking with one voice, in other words, arguing for one particular direction of move or one particular decision, versus a cacophony of voices, where some were saying up, some were saying down. Actually, usually some are saying no change, some are saying up, or some are saying no change, some are saying down. And then we looked at what happened. Now, the first thing that you find is that the market implied surprise, this is measured from 20 minutes before the decision to 20 minutes after. So right around the decision, how much the markets were surprised by the decision that was made. Markets tend to be more surprised if the preceding period had been filled with a cacophony of voices. And that we shouldn't find, again, surprising. That's just a nice proof that we've got something, at least, in the right direction. But then if you look at what is the impact of that given 1 unit change in the interest rate on either economic variables or market variables, they seem, at least in point estimate, to be different. Now, we've done it on a very small scale now, so our 2 standard deviation bands are very wide, but this is what we're working on at the moment. When they have been speaking in one voice, for a given unit of a surprise, the economic effects are much more muted. But again, this is work in progress, but we are trying to move down this road of communication and signals. Of course, the difficulty is I am still doing it from the level of abstraction that's up here, and I can't really see the individual entrepreneurs making these decisions at the moment, and I can't really see the people in China drinking heavily. Yeah. I can imagine them, yeah. I'm going to skip that one. So let me just help your time by wrapping up. I agree with the broad view that we need to understand people's behavior and we need to think about uncertainty and different types of uncertainty. I think these are important. They're important for all social sciences. They're important for macro. I want to stress that a lot of the techniques I use are not standard in macro, but I still consider myself a macroeconomist. And I think lots of you are doing work that I would say, at least in those papers, you are macroeconomists for that moment. My PhD advisor always told me, not necessarily about choice of field, but that I had to be consistent within a paper, not necessarily across them. So you can be a macroeconomist for 1 or 2 papers and then run away. But I sort of thought about this. I recently moved from Warwick to Oxford, and one of the nice things about Oxford is in the colleges you get to engage with lots of different people from different subjects, chat to them, talk about lots of things. And I think it's great. But I was thinking, knowing what I know now, if some sort of fairy godmother came down and said, Michael, you can go back, you don't have to stick with your choices, you can go back and you can do a different field, you can choose whichever one you want and you'll have the same position, it'll be absolutely fine. I think I'm happy and proud to stay as a macroeconomist. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So Sharon and Charles, and maybe Michael, you want to,